Okay, hello. Hello? Just checking. Hello? Hello? I see myself, but I do not hear myself. Why is this not going? Stream is healthy. Why is it not working? Yes, here is it is live. Why am I not live? Am I live? Let me check here. I've this going on my phone. Second. Live stream should be going. Oh, here I am. So just want to check a few things. Okay, excellent. Thanks. I'm going to get started in just a couple of seconds here. I just had to figure out a small technical issue that came, and I seem to have figured it out. Okay, so anyway, well, thanks for showing up for this. If there's anyone here, I don't see anyone here just yet. So I'll begin anyway. Hello, and welcome to the first Detoxifying Digital live stream. If there is anyone here, please say hello in the chat, and I'm going to have that open in a second. So if you're there, please say hello, and I will try to acknowledge and say hello to you back. My name is Keith Powell, and this is Detoxifying Digital. And if there's no one watching, I guess I'll be chopping this up, and if there is any highlights, I'll be posting them on the channel. This live stream will discuss AI safety and geopolitics, but in the context about what you're seing on the news, the kerfuffle between the U.S. government and Anthropic, and what the U.S. Department of War wants, and how it could escalate outside the United States, and remember all those doomsday scenarios about AI killing us all. And I'm not saying those plans will take us there, but they won't take us away from that path either. It's why AI is suddenly a geopolitical issue. I mean, has been for a while now, but recent events have really shined a light on the political side of AI. But it's not all death and doom. If you're like me, you freaking love working with AI, but you want to do it in a way that's ethical and doesn't trample on human rights or result in environmental calamity. And if that's you, then I guess you're in the right place. And do we have anybody online? Let me check. No. If you do come online, I'll be sure to check again. But before I get to the main topic, I thought I should answer the question about who the hell am I and why you should listen to what I'm saying. Some of you may have seen some of the shorts that I posted over the past couple of years, and so you're finally getting a face to that voice, but try not to focus on the zit here that has hopefully appeared on the end of my nose. I do have this channel attached to a more, I guess, grandiose project that I'm still trying to focus my communication work on. I'm hesitant to say the name out loud on this channel because it sounds very academic. And that's not what I'm trying to do here. So I put a link in the description, so if you're interested, you can check it out there. And I began this channel to help highlight some of the research I've been doing on digital policy and internet governance in general. So if you do go back and watch some of my older videos, you'll see a variety of different topics, from cyber intelligence, content moderation farms, to whatever nonsense Elon Musk is getting up to. But because of my own resource limitations, I've had to, step back a little bit, and I realized, that's okay. The reason being that there's a lot of really great research being done that could have some impact, either in public policy or even how people who aren't involved in tech or AI or anything like that can understand what the effects that these technologies are having, with many of them in ways they may not have even considered. And, my own background, in case you're wondering, is that I worked in public affairs and external relations for international organizations like the UN for a long time. My last post was as the head of external relations for a war crimes tribunal in The Hague. And I managed digital communications and a bunch of other things at the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons during these really intense periods, like this crazy period where we were involved with this multi-country chemical disarmament operation. And I was also there when we won the Nobel Peace Prize back in 2013. And I've also been involved in digital issues such as working directly to counter things like online impersonation, misinformation, and disinformation campaigns, sometimes at this global scale. And I've also led open source investigations to help identify possible criminal wrongdoing. And I've been involved in real consequential issues that affect real people and have seen up close how power and politics play out. And so I understand what's happening within the AI and digital spaces and how they intersect and how governments operate and how these tech bros could affect your day-to-day life. And one of the things that struck me the most is not the nuts and bolts of traditional diplomacy, which, don't get me wrong, I have a deep respect for, however imperfect and subject to abuse that it is. And I think it's the primary reason the global order has more or less held since the Second World War, with the exceptions of, that you're probably thinking about starting to write in the chat about but those are just that, they're exceptions. But what really began to bother me was the growing influence of tech companies in world affairs. Originally it was fine, I guess, as the social media companies were more or less progressive and seemed to at least, it looked like they wanted to do the right thing. But I think the turning point was Cambridge Analytica, which, in case you don't remember, was a scandal involving Facebook where personal data was being used for political advertising by a consulting firm called Cambridge Analytica. And they did all this without the user's consent. And this really exposed the surveillance quasi-state that these companies were building, where user data became not only a tool for big tech to use, to grow, and capitalize on, but it was also at the expense of social cohesion and harmony. It created the social friction and to help them maintain their engagement and retention. And, I think that is where it really became a noticeable problem. But for the past couple of years since leaving the UN, I've been looking more deeply at these digital issues, particularly disinformation and AI governance. These two issues aren't as far apart as they may seem, and I hope I can explain why in this and future live streams. But AI, as I said before, it's freaking awesome. I use it for a lot of things. I use it for brainstorming, evaluating ideas, and have recently been starting to experiment with AI video. And I've also been annoying my friends and family by making insulting pictures of them. But like many of you, I have my own concerns, things such as copyright, environmental impact, mass surveillance, and what has been bothering me the most, and I'll get to it in a bit, is the removal of guardrails and the push towards deregulation of AI. Tech companies and many governments have already shown that they can't be trusted to do the right thing. And just like many employees and public servants want to do, they want to build the right thing and build something that benefits humanity. But you also see leaders who only see the benefits if they can remove any barriers to them building an empire and becoming kings of the world. You will start to see that as a theme in future live streams. Sorry, this will be a theme in future live streams. I think the biggest threat that comes from the digital economy is not necessarily the products themselves, but how they are built to maximize the profits and egos of a very few people while leaving the rest of us behind. And that's what Detoxifying Digital is all about. It's about taking the toxic notions of innovation at all costs, empire building and control through technology, and to advocate for it, to fully realize the potential that digital technologies can bring without giving in to the darker impulses that are driving much of today's innovation. And that brings me to today's topic, which is AI guardrails. I want to connect the dots a little bit here. I think there are a lot of threads connecting the war that the United States and Israel are waging with Iran and the use of AI and the push for deregulation. And let's talk about the push for deregulation. My own research, and please let me know in the chat if you disagree, but it seems deregulation is a priority for the United States more than any other countries, perhaps. And it may be useful to use their AI action plan as an example and explain what some of these consequences could be. First, let's look at the cover of this AI action plan. And I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, gee, do you think that text could be any bigger? Anyway, this action plan isn't exactly new. It came out last year, last summer, I believe. But I bring this up as it provides the blueprint for what you're seeing play out with the war in Iran and the US military's issues with Anthropic. And one thing that struck me the most about this action plan is that the US government is framing it as a national security issue. And I think that's worth talking about. And I think it's because it frames AI in a new light. And here's some thoughts that I came up with on that. The first is that framing AI policy as a national security issue seems to me is an attempt to militarize AI in a way that other tech developments haven't done. And I'm going to bring the quote up here for a second. Right now, governance of AI is still being debated, and like all technological developments, the law hasn't been able to keep up with the technology and AI innovation, particularly because it's such a disruptive technology and it has the potential for plans that may not be good for society to sneak through while regulation and standards are still being sorted out. And this brings me to the bold statements that the action plan makes to kick things off. Right there in the introduction of the action plan, they start with these comments. The United States is in a race to achieve global dominance in artificial intelligence. Whoever has the largest AI ecosystem will set global AI standards and reap economic and military benefits. These ideas raise some concerning questions. First, I want you to look at the phrasing they use. The United States is in a race to achieve, quote, global dominance. They are not looking to provide leadership. They are looking to dominate. And in this quest for dominance, they are seeking to set global standards and reap the economic and military benefits. And a couple things on that. First, I don't fault the United States for putting their interests first. Every country does that. That's what forms the basis for foreign policy. But the issue I have with this philosophy is that it is essentially flexing its muscle and imposing its policies on the rest of the world. And even allies may have a different view on how AI should be managed and regulated. And I think we're starting to see some pushback on this. I've been seeing more and more references to what is being called digital sovereignty, and the World Economic Forum describes it like this. Digital sovereignty is the ability of nations to control their own digital destiny, including infrastructure, data, and software that is free from external coercion. Well, let's break that down into simpler ideas. It basically means that a country should be able to control its own digital assets. And the funny thing is that this fundamentally goes against the original idea of the internet when it was envisioned to be a borderless networked space. And about 10 years ago, it seemed like only authoritarian regimes were talking about these ideas. You saw concepts like walled national internets being considered, and these ideas were considered, authoritarian. And while the concept of digital sovereignty doesn't necessarily mean walling a country off from the rest of the world digitally, it does have some of the same characteristics, even if they aren't meant the same way. Instead of closing the internet off to control their people and access, you may see digital sovereignty being used as a means to protect their people. And I can hear, those of you on the internet know going on about this being a new kind of repression, blah, 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 blah. But there is a difference between setting policies to surveil and track its citizens and creating policies to prevent big tech companies in foreign states to do the same thing. It's an issue that, like I said, has become more and more prevalent. I'll discuss this in upcoming live streams in the next couple of weeks. So what does this have to do with America's AI strategy? Well, I refer you to two things. The first is a quote by U.S. President J.D. Vance regarding the need for deregulation of AI and recent attempts by the American military to remove certain safety restrictions from Claude AI. The American AI strategy says it is built on 3 pillars. And the first one is innovation, I believe. Let me see, where am I at here? Innovation is the first one. Then we have infrastructure and international diplomacy and security. And in order to achieve this, it appears that the main framework comes from the tech bro philosophy of innovation above all. In fact, they quote U.S. President J.D. Vance, who you may remember has deep connections to the venture capital community in the United States, and who told the Paris AI Action Summit in February 2025 that restricting AI development with what he calls, quote, onerous regulation would, quote, not only unfairly benefit incumbents, it would mean paralyzing one of the most promising technologies we have seen in generations. And that assertion is absolutely debatable. An AI policy framework like this has resulted in concerns being raised by major AI thinkers and are at odds with how other countries approach AI, including China, surprisingly enough, which the US considers its main rival in the AI competition. But we see this policy play out in more and more meaningful ways with the recent kerfuffle with Anthropic and certain aspects of how the American government is conducting its war in Iran. And those of you in the chat, what do you think? Am I out to lunch on this? Let me know if you have any questions or comments on this so far. Also, if you found this useful, please, I haven't said this already, but please subscribe to the channel so you can follow more live streams and videos such as this one. But let's start with Anthropic. Like I mentioned earlier, the Pentagon asked Anthropic to remove certain safety restrictions from Claude AI. Anthropic refused, and citing 2 primary ethical red lines. The first one is mass domestic surveillance. And Anthropic refused to allow its technology to be used to track or spy on American citizens without any kind of judicial oversight. The other was lethal autonomous weapons. The company argued that current AI is not reliable enough to make life or death decisions on the battlefield, and refused to let Claude power weapons that fire without the human in the loop. And in response, the Trump administration essentially blacklisted Claude AI from the federal government. Anthropic has since fired back with a lawsuit of its own. So what does this have to do with the war in Iran? A couple of things. From a geopolitical perspective, gambling with destabilizing the Middle East with a regional war puts the American economy, and with it much of the Western world's economy, in danger of collapse. And here's why. Gulf states are currently anchoring the American economy, as they are the ones that are investing heavily in AI companies and are basically financing the AI bubble. If the oil states are no longer able to continue this financing, which could happen if they're pulled into this war, then this could burst the AI bubble, bringing the American economy down, which would have effects that would be felt globally. Next, one of the ways that AI could be used in warfare, such as the one in Iran, is through the use of autonomous weapons, where targets and decisions to strike are made by AI without human review or approval. Personally, if I were a military commander, that is the kind of control I would be very, very hard pressed to give up. In fact, it seems downright irresponsible and probably illegal. But the US is using AI and indeed still using Claude, it seems, for the use of drones and for target selections. And this crosses ethical red lines in ways such as being referred to as the speed of war. AI has empowered the US and Israel to strike over 1,000 targets in its first 24 hours of the war, which is a pace that is impossible for human analysts to identify by themselves. However, Anthropic's red line here is that a human must always make the final decision to fire, and that does not seem unreasonable. The Pentagon, however, is pushing for what they call, quote, imperfect alignment over the risk of what they're saying is, quote, not moving fast enough against Iranian and Chinese capabilities. And with this, I refer you back to the US AI Action Plan, which, if you recall, called for the removal of what they called unnecessary burdens, i.e. regulation, that would paralyze innovation. And this is a real-life example of what they mean by that. And if you want to enter doom thinking, and it might be interesting, as a thought experiment to do just that, let's think about for a second what this means if this is taken to an extreme. 1, you give the AI the ability to identify targets in an active conflict. 2, it identifies an overwhelming amount of targets, more than your analysts could conceivably identify on their own. 3, it does so in a very short amount of time. 4, while it's not been given explicit instructions to strike, the military's tolerance for an imperfect system opens the door for AI to reason, well, they didn't tell me not to strike. 5, so if it strikes, maybe before military leaders even realize the attack is underway. And I can see the following consequences when this play out. The first is that 1, this may be a violation of international law. 2, the targets may include non-combatants. And 3, military leaders could point the finger at each other, denying responsibility because no one explicitly gave an order to strike. Command responsibility be damned. And let's stretch this scenario out a bit. The AI could conceivably come up with this on its own, with its own war or attack plans, and decide not to share them. And this is not fantasy. Researchers are aware of 2 interesting developments that make this a little scary. The first is what is called recursive self-improvement, where, in a nutshell, AI improves itself by using its own inputs, outputs, or code to train its future iterations. And in other words, it does its own updates. The other is that in some AI tests, the AI knew it was being watched and changed its behavior accordingly. This is especially interesting to me. A study by Apollo Research found that the AI models behaved in a, quote, safe and compliant manner while under evaluation, what they're calling while the manager is in the room, but changed to more risky or undesirable behaviors once they believed the evaluation was over. And these 2 developments alone point to the danger of AI authority to identify and use weapons without a human decision maker. What do you guys think? Am I just being paranoid? If you put your thoughts in, I'd like to discuss that with you guys. Okay. Well, that was the heavy part. I'm going to close out this live stream with a more interesting use of AI. I know it's about AI slop and AI content. I know AI slop is everywhere. You have tech bros and other really uncreative people posting AI crap because they think it can make money, and it shows up in all of our feeds. And personally, I think the worst offender is LinkedIn. I've even seen replies to posts that were clearly written by ChatGPT. But I do find AI creatively fascinating. While I get the ethical issues surrounding AI art, such as copyright, where did the training data come from, for example? Appropriation and, cultural diffusion. I also am curious about AI as a way to stretch the human imagination and using creativity as a way to understand how AI thinks and interprets our world. But I did a bit of an experiment. Let me pull this up. Yeah, check this out. I made this image by asking ChatGPT to create Edward Munch's The Scream as if it were made by Walt Disney. And as you can see, they nailed it. But it did raise a couple questions for me, like, we know The Scream is a painting in the public domain. But Disney's intellectual property is not. So how did ChatGPT know how to create this? So I asked ChatGPT, and here is what it told me. It gave me a bunch of reasons. The first is how it knows what Disney style looks like. It said, models like me are trained on a very large mixture of data that includes publicly available text and images, licensed data sets, data created by human trainers. During training, the system does not memorize specific artwork or images in a way that a database would. Instead, it learns statistical patterns across many examples. For visual styles, this means that the model learns things like typical color palettes, character proportions, which includes things like large eyes or rounded shapes, line smoothness, facial expression conventions, animation era aesthetics. So when someone asks for something like The Scream in the style of Walt Disney, the model essentially combines two sets of learned visual patterns: Edward Munch type composition, which is the bridge, the figure, the sky squirrel, and common features associated with classic Western animation styles. And it generates a new image that statistically resembles those patterns rather than retrieving or copying an existing Disney image. Think of it more like a painter who has seen many cartoons and internalized their visual language rather than someone pulling frames from a Disney film. Okay, they're not answering the question here. Classic Western animation style does not necessarily equal Walt Disney. So they're not answering the question here. Let's move on to the second one. Did OpenAI license Disney data? And then let me pull this up here. OpenAI has publicly stated that models are trained on licensed data, data created by human trainers, publicly available data, but OpenAI does not publish the full list of specific data sets or companies whose material might appear in training corpora. Corpora is a new word for me. So the truthful answer is there has not been a public statement that OpenAI licensed Disney's artwork specifically, and it is not also publicly confirmed whether blah, 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 blah. In short, no public evidence exists that Disney directly licensed its data to OpenAI for training. And for their final explanation was to explain why AI systems can reproduce recognizable styles. Let me pull this up. And it says, even without direct licensing from a particular studio, models can still learn recognizable styles because the internet contains vast amounts of commentary, analysis, screenshots, and derivative artwork. Here's where we're really getting into it. And the copyright does enter into play here, I think. Style characteristics appear across many artists influenced by the same tradition. Animation styles, including Disney's, are widely documented and discussed. So the model earns the pattern of the style, not the proprietary artwork itself. Okay, fair enough, but it still really doesn't answer the question. It vaguely refers to things like vast amount of commentary, analysis, screenshots, and derivative artwork. Everything done in the style of Disney, so they can take all this information and say, well, we can package this into a pattern that says this is what a Walt Disney image looks like. So again, they're not really answering the question directly. What they do come up with an interesting thing, and this is more of a recent policy trend they're saying, is that because of ongoing, because of ongoing copyright debates, such as the one I'm bringing up now, many AI systems, including ChatGPT, are moving towards avoiding requests that explicitly mimic living artist styles. Fair enough. That is a good policy, I believe, actually. Studios are in a slightly different category, but the general direction in AI policy is towards style generalizations, such as 1930s American animation style, which, well, if they're referring to Disney, that may be where they started their most recognizable animation style, but it did continue to progress since then. Anyway, avoiding direct imitation requests tied to specific creators, and ChatGPT said, actually, no, that's it. So the thing is, I noticed though when it says that, if the model learns the pattern of the style, not the proprietary artwork itself, the pattern has to come from someone. And that's my big thing. Screenshots, documented thing, like all of that could be coming from documented or copyrighted work, or work that could be considered, copyrightable. Or the imagery on the screenshot could be considered a copyrighted image, not necessarily the screenshot itself. And that's where ChatGPT, I think, really avoided answering this question. And so, I think I'm going to wrap it up here. If you're still here, wow, thank you. And please drop a comment in the chat and I'll try to respond. And also, please subscribe to Detoxifying Digital. And if you like this video or found it interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe for the next or upcoming videos. And I'll be back in the next week or so with a new live stream. And I'll post the topic and maybe a teaser video for it first. But anyway, I'm Keith Powell, and this has been Detoxifying Digital, the live stream. I will see you next time.